Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I will be simulating the 2020 Formula 1 season in F1 Manager 2024. I do plan to make this a series as we continue along seasons all stemming from this 2020 season. Just in case you have forgotten, here is a recap of the 2020 F1 grid. At Mercedes we have Hamilton and Bottas. Ferraris, Leclerc and Vettel rivalry. Could Red Bull's revolving door be stopped early as they remain with Verstappen and Albon? McLaren still has Lando. Ocon and Ricciardo fill out Renault. Racing Point has Stroll and Perez. Alfa Romeo Sauber have the aging Raikkonen and Giovinazzi. AlphaTauri has the Red Bull rejects of Kvyat and Gasly. Haas stick with Grosjean and Magnussen. And finally at Williams we have the young George Russell and Latifi. But without further ado, let's head into this season. Round 1 in Bahrain would open with what we all expected: Hamilton winning from pole and Verstappen right behind. Lando Norris would round off the podium, narrowly beating Bottas to the line. However, Red Bull's Alex Albon would finish far off the front, being beaten by the McLarens. Ocon and Leclerc, Perez and Vettel would round off the points positions. This obviously allowed Mercedes to go to the top of the constructors. Round 2 would differ, as Bottas would both out-qualify and beat Hamilton in the race as he overtook Verstappen from pole, as well as an excellent drive from both Ferraris as Charles Leclerc finished P6 from P19 on the grid. And while Albon was closer to the pace of Verstappen, he was convincingly beat by Sainz, who finished 5 seconds ahead. Leclerc almost made it a P5, and with a few more laps could have also beaten Albon. Valtteri edged closer to Hamilton at the top as Sainz and Stroll shooted up the standings. In Australia, Max Verstappen would once more fumble a win from pole position, finishing 42 seconds off of Hamilton, who would pass Max and Bottas for the win. Once again the Ferraris would pull off a masterclass as Vettel would go from 15th to the podium, and Charles would manage to get almost as far. AlphaTauri would also manage their first points, with an excellent drive from Daniil Kvyat. In the standings, Leclerc and Vettel would continue to climb the standings, which in turn would knock McLaren down to P4 in the constructors. Suzuka, however, was a very different story. Bottas would win from pole, whilst both Hamilton and Verstappen would be beaten by Alex Albon, who even built up a significant gap to Hamilton after overtaking him on the line. Leclerc would pull off a decent race, as Ricciardo would get a good points finish, with Vettel being nowhere near the pace of the top 10. Bottas would finally jump Hamilton in the standings as Albon would begin to work his way back up. In China, the first sprint race would take place, which would prove to Hamilton's favor as he would beat both Red Bulls to the win. In the full race, Hamilton would win from pole with Bottas behind, making it a Mercedes 1-2, with Norris getting another podium for McLaren, as Verstappen would get a terrible start, luckily managing to finish 10th. Albon and Vettel would beat both their teammates by a large margin, as Verstappen finished 10th and Leclerc in 12th. Hamilton's amazing weekend would allow him to take the top spot in the standings, with Albon gaining of Verstappen. McLaren also managed to top Ferrari in the constructors. In Miami, Hamilton would beat Bottas in the sprint. There would also be good drive from Gasly finishing 6th. However, in the main race, Bottas would win from P3, with both McLarens finishing in the points and Carlos getting McLaren's 3rd podium. With the interchanging wins between the two, Bottas would be only 2 points away from Hamilton, while Racing Point took P5 in the constructors from Renault. Round 7 in Imola would drastically turn the tide, as Hamilton would DNF, leading to Bottas winning, even though the fastest lap was taken by Verstappen. It was a double points finish for both Racing Points as well as Gasly, and Ricciardo finishing 7th and 8th, with George Russell getting a surprise point in the Williams, with Bottas now having a 23-point lead to Hamilton. it would be very difficult for Hamilton to catch back up. Monaco would finally prove an interesting race, as Bottas would extend his lead over Hamilton, whilst the Alpha Taurus finish 8th and 9th, along with yet another P10 from Russell. Round 9. In Canada, would be shocking as Albon would win the race from P2, after a costly pit stop from Bottas, meaning that Albon would get a win in the Red Bull before Max Verstappen, with yet another double points finish from the Alpha Taurus. This turn in pace for the Alpha Taurus would bring them closer and closer to Renault in the constructors. In Spain, Hamilton would continue slowly chipping away at Valtteri's lead. Despite Bottas still getting the fastest lap, Albon would DNF after his win, which led to Raikkonen being promoted from P11 to P10, allowing Alfa Romeo to finally get some points in the standings. Both Renaults would also finish well within the points, with the Alpha Taurus being nowhere near the points, being in 12th and 16th. The midfield battle would still remain strong as Norris took Leclerc for 6th. At the Red Bull Ring, Bottas would beat Hamilton to pole position in the sprint with a surprise P3 from Esteban Ocon in the Renault, allowing them to firmly beat AlphaTauri with Gasly finishing 7th. Both Red Bulls had a terrible weekend, with Albon making somewhat of a comeback after a poor qualifying. Bottas would do the exact same thing in the race, with Ocon being 0.3 off finishing P3 again, narrowly being beaten by Albon. Ferrari seemed to have dropped in pace, with Renault once more finishing farther up the pack. Ocon would jump up to P10 whilst the McLarens battled it out for P6 with only 2 points within it. Esteban and Ricciardo would allow Renault to take racing point in the constructors. Hamilton would win his home Grand Prix in Silverstone, and even win in Hungary with 2 P3s from Norris, and a good race from Daniel Kvyat in Silverstone. The battle between Renault and Racing Point would heat up as Racing Point regained P5. In Spa, Valtteri would take the win with a disastrous weekend from both Max and Lewis. Albon would once more out-qualify and beat Verstappen in the race. Ocon, Perez and Raikkonen notably had a great weekend with a P2, 4 and 7 respectively. Perez would overcome Vettel in the standings, and Bottas would build up a larger lead. Renault and Alfa Romeo would advance in the constructors due to the great weekend. Round 14. In Zandvoort, would result in a surprising win from Esteban Ocon by over 50 seconds. He had a total grand slam over the Mercs and Red Bulls. Raikkonen would qualify P10 and finish 8th, gaining crucial points for Alfa Romeo in the championship. However, the Ferraris barely managed to finish 9th and 10th. In Monza, Ocon would once more win, but with far more intense battling with Hamilton. Perez even managed to pull off an amazing P3. Albon would manage to out-qualify and out-race Verstappen, and there was yet another points finish from the AlphaTauri of Gasly. Due to Bottas DNF, Hamilton would come within 5 points of Bottas once more, with Ocon even taking himself farther up the standings, now ahead of both Ferraris in the drivers and constructors. In Baku, Leclerc would pull off a masterclass, winning from P6 with both Mercedes having a terrible qualifying and race, as Ocon beat them to P2. Hamilton and Albon would jump their teammates in the standings, as Hamilton beat Bottas and Max would DNF from pole, with Charles and Ocon taking Sainz, keeping things interesting in the midfield. In Singapore, Albon would once more beat Verstappen, as he would win from pole with Ocon and Max finishing 2 and 3. After Sainz would fumble P2 away, the Mercs were both miles down, finishing 10th and 11th with both Gasly and Raikkonen getting some nice points. With Ocon overtaking Norris in the standings, Renault would inch closer to McLaren in the constructors. The sprint in COTA would go to Ocon, as he edges out Hamilton and Norris by 7/10 to P1, with Bottas still lagging behind, only managing 5th. With the main race going to Norris, who would finally get a win, with Ricciardo and Sainz rounding off the podium, with Bottas and Hamilton clearly no longer having the fastest car. With the shocking race, the midfield would shake up as Norris got back on Ocon to become best of the rest, while Carlos took Charles, and Danny Ric taking P9. Mexico would surprise everyone, with Max Verstappen, at long last, winning from pole with a double McLaren podium, and a Mercedes 4 and 5, with a good finish from Pierre in 6th. With only 12 points separating the two championship contenders, the last couple of rounds would be crucial to decide the championship. Verstappen would reclaim P3 in the championship from Albon, after finally claiming a win. Interlagos would begin with the sprint, where Norris would take the top spot. However, Pierre Gasly would take P2 and was only 4/10 off the win. In the main race, Gasly would narrowly miss out on a podium, with Max Verstappen beating him to P3, with Hamilton and Perez taking 1 and 2, giving Hamilton a larger lead, and giving Racing Point their second podium of the season. Perez and Ocon would advance in the standings, with Hamilton building up a farther lead to Bottas. In Vegas, Verstappen would charge to the line to take P1, with Perez once more taking P2, and Bottas in P3, with a double points finish for AlphaTauri as Bottas moves closer to Hamilton for the last 2 rounds. The sprint in Qatar would open with a double podium for Renault, and a P2 from Bottas, with Hamilton scoring no points. In the main race, Ricciardo and Ocon would secure the same positions, but Norris would take P2, with Bottas beating Hamilton despite finishing 5th, bringing the gap to 15 points. Racing Point would also reclaim 5th from Ferrari. Abu Dhabi would come to a close, with Max Verstappen in P1, Norris in P2, and Ocon in P3. Sainz would finish P4, with Bottas in P5 with the double points. Finale, Bottas would score 20 points, allowing Bottas to win by 5 points too, and would become 2020 World Drivers' Champion. Norris would also take P4 from Albon, bringing the season to a close. At the end of the season, the driver market would open. Hamilton, disappointed with Mercedes' handling of the championship, and moved to Ferrari, who had fired Sebastian Vettel for being drastically outperformed by his younger teammate Charles Leclerc. Mercedes were happy to accept the multiple-time world champion. Red Bull, despite Albon almost beating Verstappen, would fire Albon, who wouldn't get a seat for the 2021 season. Ricciardo, tired of being second to Ocon, would for some reason return to Red Bull to partner Verstappen once more. Bottas, disappointed with Mercedes' performance towards the end of the season, would fill the open Renault seat. Stroll would move to Mercedes, and Guan Yu Zhou would fill the open seat at Racing Point. Kvyat and Giovinazzi would be fired from their teams due to being outperformed by their teammates. Tsunoda would partner Raikkonen at Alfa Romeo, and Hülkenberg would regain a seat in F1, partnering Gasly at AlphaTauri. Latifi would retire due to lack of performance and would be replaced by Alonso, who returned from retirement and went to Williams. Hi everyone. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed, feel free to subscribe, as this video took lots of time and effort.